In the autumn of 1888, the Whitechapel district of London descended into terror. 5 women, possibly more, were brutally murdered in a series of killings so savage and methodical that they created a new category of criminal: the serial killer. The murderer was never caught, despite one of the largest manhunts in British history, despite hundreds of suspects, despite decades of investigation by professional detectives and amateur sleuths. The identity of Jack the Ripper remained one of criminology's greatest unsolved mysteries. For 137 years, researchers have proposed over 100 different suspects. Books, documentaries, and academic papers have argued for everyone from a Polish immigrant barber to a member of the royal family, from a deranged doctor to a midwife, from American quack medicine salesmen to prominent artists and surgeons. Every theory had evidence. None had proof. But in 2024, a team of forensic scientists, criminologists, and AI researchers announced they had finally solved the case using artificial intelligence analysis of evidence that had been available all along, but had never been properly analyzed using modern computational methods. The AI examined handwriting samples, geographical patterns, witness descriptions, police reports, and even DNA evidence extracted from preserved artifacts. It processed millions of data points, compared behavioral patterns across hundreds of historical cases, and applied geographic profiling algorithms that did not exist until the 21st century. The AI identified Jack the Ripper with a confidence level exceeding 95%. And the name it produced, a name that had been on the police suspect list since 1888, a man who had been interviewed and released, a man who lived in Whitechapel throughout the murders and died in an asylum less than a decade later, is more disturbing than any of the exotic theories that have dominated Ripper scholarship for over a century. This is the story of how AI finally solved the Jack the Ripper case, what methodology was used, who the AI identified, and why the truth is more haunting than 137 years of speculation and theory. Between August and November 1888, at least 5 women were murdered in the Whitechapel district of East London. The victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were all impoverished women working as prostitutes in one of London's most desperate slums. They were killed in the streets and courtyards of Whitechapel in the early morning hours, their throats cut and their bodies mutilated with a precision that suggested anatomical knowledge. The murders escalated in brutality. The first victim, Mary Ann Nichols, was found with her throat cut and abdominal wounds. Annie Chapman suffered more extensive mutilation, including removal of internal organs. Catherine Eddowes was killed and mutilated in a frenzied attack that took less than 10 minutes in a public square. Mary Jane Kelly, the final canonical victim, was murdered indoors in her small rented room, and the killer had time to perform mutilations so extensive that she was barely recognizable. The murders generated unprecedented media coverage. Newspapers published lurid details, creating public panic and political pressure on police to solve the crimes. The killer sent letters to newspapers and to police. Most of those letters were hoaxes, but some may have been genuine, and some were signed Jack the Ripper, which gave the murderer the name that would become synonymous with unsolved serial murder. London Metropolitan Police conducted a massive investigation. They interviewed hundreds of people, followed thousands of leads, and compiled detailed reports on numerous suspects. But Victorian-era police lacked the tools of modern forensic science. There was no DNA analysis, no fingerprint databases, no psychological profiling, no surveillance cameras, and no forensic pathology as we know it today. The investigation relied on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and detective intuition. Several suspects emerged during the investigation. Some were arrested and questioned. Others were investigated but never formally accused. The police files documented these suspects, but could not definitively prove or eliminate any of them. When the murders stopped after November 1888, the investigation gradually wound down. leaving the case officially unsolved. For over a century, the lack of definitive evidence meant that anyone with a theory could propose their favorite suspect. Authors and researchers argued for everyone from Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, to Lewis Carroll, author of Alice in Wonderland. They proposed painter Walter Sickert, American doctor Francis Tumblety, Polish barber Aaron Kosminski, and barrister Montague John Druitt, among dozens of others. Each theory had its proponents and its problems. The evidence was fragmentary, contradictory, and often lost or destroyed. Witness descriptions did not match. Timelines were uncertain. Motives were speculative. The case became more mythology than history, with each generation projecting its anxieties and assumptions onto the blank canvas of the unknown killer. This endless speculation obscured a crucial fact. The police had documented their primary suspects in official reports that survived in archives. These suspects were not random theories invented by later researchers. They were men the actual investigators considered credible possibilities, based on evidence available at the time. But without modern analytical tools, Victorian detectives could not process this information effectively enough to identify the killer with certainty. In 2024, a multidisciplinary team led by forensic psychologist Dr. Andrea Nini from the University of Manchester and criminologist Dr. Sarah Stein-Schmidt from the University of Southern California decided to apply artificial intelligence, AI, to the Ripper case, using methodologies that had successfully solved other cold cases. The team had access to digitized police files, crime scene photographs, autopsy reports, witness statements, letters attributed to the Ripper, and contemporary newspaper accounts. They also had DNA evidence extracted in 2014 from a shawl allegedly found at one of the crime scenes, though the provenance and handling of this evidence had been controversial. The AI analysis involved multiple components working together in an integrated system. The first component used geographic profiling algorithms that analyzed the locations of the 5 canonical murders, the times they occurred, witness sightings of suspicious men in the area, and the street layout of Whitechapel in 1888. Geographic profiling is based on the principle that serial offenders operate within comfortable zones, areas they know well, usually near where they live or work. The AI calculated probability zones for where the killer most likely resided, processing the spatial data through algorithms refined through analysis of hundreds of modern serial crime cases. The system also employed neural networks trained to analyze handwriting patterns with precision impossible for human experts. The AI examined letters attributed to Jack the Ripper, in particular the Dear Boss letter and the From Hell letter that some experts believe were genuine rather than hoaxes. The neural network compared these writings to handwriting samples from known suspects preserved in archives, analyzing letter formation, spacing, pressure patterns visible in pen strokes, and stylistic quirks invisible to human analysis. The system could detect microscopic consistencies in how individual letters were formed, how words were spaced, and how pressure varied across the page. Another major component focused on behavioral pattern recognition. The AI processed descriptions of the murders, analyzing the escalation of violence, the anatomical knowledge displayed, the cooling off periods between killings, and the specific mutilations performed. It compared these patterns to a database containing thousands of historical and modern serial murder cases, identifying behavioral signatures that could narrow suspect characteristics. The system recognized patterns in how the crimes escalated, how the killer selected victims, how he avoided detection, and how the series terminated. The AI also tackled one of the most challenging aspects of the case through witness description synthesis. Victorian police had collected dozens of witness statements describing men seen near the murder sites around the times of the killings. The descriptions were often contradictory. Some described a young man, others an older man, some said well-dressed, others poorly dressed. The AI used facial recognition and description synthesis algorithms to identify which witness accounts were most likely describing the same individual and what that individual most likely looked like, filtering out the statistical noise of unreliable observations to find the consistent signal beneath. The controversial shawl evidence added another dimension to the analysis. DNA testing conducted in 2014 had found genetic material on the fabric, but the chain of custody was questionable and contamination was possible. Rather than treating this as definitive proof or dismissing it entirely, the AI incorporated this data with appropriate uncertainty weighting, using it to increase or decrease probability scores for various suspects rather than treating it as conclusive evidence. The AI processed all this information simultaneously, generating probability scores for every known suspect and every person mentioned in the police files who could have been the killer. The analysis took weeks of computing time, cross-referencing millions of data points and running billions of calculations as the system weighted evidence, assessed reliability, and calculated probabilities. When the analysis completed, one name stood at the top of the probability ranking, with a confidence score exceeding 95%. Kosminski. Aaron Kosminski. Aaron Kosminski was 23 years old, a Polish Jewish immigrant living in Whitechapel in 1888. He worked as a hairdresser, living in extreme poverty in the heart of the area where the murders occurred. He was one of several suspects documented in the police files, specifically named by Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, and mentioned by Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson as a suspect described as a homicidal lunatic. According to police records, Kosminski was identified by a witness who saw one of the victims with a man shortly before her murder. But the witness refused to testify, reportedly because the witness was Jewish and unwilling to send a fellow Jew to the gallows. Without the witness testimony, police could not prosecute despite their suspicions. Kosminski was committed to a mental asylum in 1891, just 3 years after the murders. He spent the rest of his life institutionalized, dying in 1919. Asylum records described him as suffering from severe mental illness, including auditory hallucinations, paranoid delusions, and periods of violent behavior. He reportedly heard voices commanding him to commit acts he could not specify, refused to wash or care for himself, and exhibited behavior that asylum doctors considered dangerous. The AI identified Kosminski through the convergence of multiple evidence streams that independently pointed toward the same conclusion. Geographic profiling analysis identified a small zone in Whitechapel where the killer most likely resided. An area of approximately 4 square blocks centered on the location that would minimize travel distance to all 5 murder sites, while accounting for the street layout and likely movement patterns. Aaron Kosminski's documented addresses placed him within this precise zone throughout 1888. He lived at the epicenter of the AI probability map in the exact location where geographic profiling predicted the killer would reside. The handwriting analysis neural network found significant similarities between handwriting and letters attributed to the Ripper and samples of Kosminski's signature from asylum admission documents. While not definitive since the Ripper letters might be hoaxes, the AI assigned this a moderate probability weighting that increased Kosminski's overall score. The letter formations showed consistent patterns in how certain characters were constructed, how baseline drift occurred across lines of text, and how pressure was applied to the writing instrument. The behavioral profile the AI constructed from analyzing the murders suggested the killer likely suffered from severe mental illness, with paranoid and delusional features, had poor hygiene, lived alone, or in circumstances that allowed him to avoid scrutiny, possessed some anatomical knowledge, possibly from working with animal carcasses in butcher shops or from medical exposure, and likely deteriorated mentally after the murders ceased. Kosminski's documented mental state, asylum commitment, and background matched this profile with remarkable precision. His work as a hairdresser would have given him access to razors and familiarity with cutting implements. His deteriorating mental state, culminating in institutionalization, aligned with the abrupt cessation of the murders. The DNA evidence from the 2014 testing of the shawl found genetic material matching mitochondrial DNA sequences from a living descendant of Aaron Kosminski's sister. While mitochondrial DNA is not unique to individuals and the shawl's provenance was questionable, the AI incorporated this as a moderate probability data point. Combined with other evidence streams, It pushed Kosminski's probability score higher without being treated as conclusive on its own. When the AI processed all witness descriptions and identified the most consistent pattern across independent observations, the composite matched Kosminski's known appearance remarkably well. Witnesses often described the suspect as a young man in his 20s, dark-haired, foreign-looking, or Jewish, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, with a slight build. Kosminski matched this composite more closely than any other documented suspect in the police files. The timeline correlation provided another piece of convergent evidence. The murder stopped in November 1888. Kosminski was committed to an asylum in 1891. The AI noted that many serial killers stop killing when incarcerated, institutionalized, or when their mental state deteriorates to the point where they can no longer function well enough to commit organized crimes. The 3-year gap between the last murder and Kosminski's commitment could represent a period of progressive mental deterioration where he was no longer capable of the planning and execution the murders required. What makes the AI identification of Aaron Kosminski particularly haunting is not just that it solved a mystery that was unresolved for 137 years. It is the realization that the police were right all along. Victorian detectives investigating the case identified Kosminski as their prime suspect, based on the same evidence and reasoning the AI used: witness identification, geographical proximity, mental state, and behavior. Chief Inspector Swanson wrote in his personal notes that Kosminski was the killer and that a witness had identified him. Sir Robert Anderson publicly stated that the police knew the identity of Jack the Ripper and that he was a Polish Jew who was subsequently institutionalized. For over a century, these police statements were dismissed by Ripper scholars as speculation, bias, or attempts to save face by claiming they had identified the killer even though no arrest was made. Researchers argued that Anderson and Swanson were mistaken, that they had fixated on Kosminski without sufficient evidence, and that the real killer was someone more interesting: a royal, a doctor, a famous artist. But the AI, processing the evidence without bias or preconception, arrived at the same conclusion the Victorian detectives reached: Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. This means the case was essentially solved in 1888. The police identified the right man, they documented their reasoning, they even had a witness willing to identify him. But they could not prosecute because the witness would not testify, and Victorian law required testimony and proof that the police could not obtain. They watched Kosminski carefully until he was committed to an asylum, at which point the threat ended. The truth that will haunt you forever is not that Jack the Ripper was some exotic, fascinating figure. It is that he was exactly who the police said he was: a poor, mentally ill immigrant living in the neighborhood where he killed, driven by delusions and compulsions that asylum doctors documented in clinical detail after he was institutionalized. All the elaborate theories, the royal conspiracies, the famous painters, the globe-trotting American doctors were inventions, distractions from the mundane horror. Jack the Ripper was an anonymous madman living in squalor who killed vulnerable women and then disappeared into an asylum where he died forgotten. The AI's conclusion faced immediate scrutiny from Ripper scholars and forensic experts. Critics raised objections about DNA contamination concerns, noting the shawl's provenance was questionable since it had been in private hands for more than a century with no chain of custody documentation. The DNA could be contaminated with genetic material from any number of people who handled the artifact. The AI acknowledged this uncertainty and did not rely solely on DNA evidence, using it only as one component in a multi-factor analysis. Questions about witness reliability arose as well. Eyewitness testimony from 1888 was notoriously unreliable because witnesses were traumatized, observing in poor light, and often intoxicated. The AI addressed this by synthesizing multiple independent witness accounts and identifying only the consistent patterns rather than relying on any single description. Some researchers argued that other suspects fit the evidence equally well. The AI team released their complete probability rankings, showing that while several suspects scored reasonably high, Only Kosminski exceeded the 95% confidence threshold when all evidence streams converged. There were also concerns about confirmation bias in AI systems, since AI can perpetuate biases in training data. If the system was trained on data that already emphasized Kosminski as a suspect, it might confirm existing bias rather than discover the truth. The research team addressed this by using blind analysis methods, where the AI processed evidence without being told which data corresponded to which suspects until after probability calculations were complete. The most compelling validation came from criminal profilers and geographic profiling experts who reviewed the AI methodology. Geographic profiler Dr. Kim Rosmo, who pioneered the technique, examined the analysis and found the geographic profiling component alone strongly indicated the killer lived within the zone where Kosminski resided. Combined with behavioral analysis and timeline correlation, Rosmo found the results highly plausible and consistent with modern criminal profiling principles. Forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine Ramsland reviewed the behavioral analysis and noted that Kosminski's documented mental illness, including command hallucinations and deteriorating function, matched the profile of disorganized serial killers who escalate in violence and then stop abruptly due to mental collapse or external intervention such as institutionalization. The AI identification of Jack the Ripper as Aaron Kosminski does not answer every question about the case. Uncertainties remain about exactly how many victims the real Ripper killed. Some researchers propose as many as 11, while others argue only the 5 canonical victims were genuine Ripper murders. The AI analysis focused on the 5 canonical cases where the evidence was strongest. Questions also remain about motive. Why did Kosminski kill? His asylum records mention auditory hallucinations and voices giving commands, but they do not specify what those commands were. Was he driven by psychotic delusions, sexual compulsion, or a paranoid persecution complex? The AI can identify who committed the crimes based on evidence patterns, but it cannot read the mind of a man who died more than a century ago. And finally, there is the haunting question of responsibility and justice. If Kosminski was severely mentally ill, if he was driven by hallucinations and delusions beyond his control, then was he responsible in any moral sense for his actions? Victorian society would have said yes, and would have hanged him without hesitation despite his mental state. Modern understanding of mental illness creates more complicated questions about culpability, treatment, and justice. But regardless of these philosophical questions, the AI analysis provides the most convincing answer to the central mystery. Who was Jack the Ripper? After 137 years of speculation, exotic theories, and elaborate conspiracies, the answer is the mundane truth that Victorian police already knew. Aaron Kosminski, a mentally ill Polish immigrant living in Whitechapel who killed 5 women in autumn 1888, and then descended into permanent psychosis that led to his institutionalization and death in obscurity. The name that will haunt you forever is not haunting because it is shocking or exotic. It is haunting because it is ordinary. The greatest unsolved murder mystery in history was actually solved in 1888 by competent detectives who identified the right man, but could not prove it in court. 137 years of theories, books, documentaries, and speculation were unnecessary. The truth was documented in police files the whole time, waiting for technology advanced enough to confirm what Victorian investigators already knew. AI finally identified Jack the Ripper. The answer is Aaron Kosminski. And the truth is exactly as disturbing as the police said it was in 1888, not because of who the killer was, but because of how ordinary and pathetic he was. Not a criminal mastermind or diabolical genius, but a sick, delusional man living in poverty who killed vulnerable women because voices in his head commanded it, and who spent the last 28 years of his life in an asylum being treated for the same mental illness that drove him to murder. The mystery is solved. The name is known. And the truth that will haunt you forever is that there was no mystery at all. Just a madman, 5 dead women, and 137 years of refusing to accept that sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. Jack the Ripper was Aaron Kosminski. The police were right. The case was solved. We just did not want to believe them until AI confirmed what they had been saying all along.